love how eager we are to jump in a deep way. And I'm seeing just wonderful squares of our Square One participants showing up on the screen. Very excited to be with all of you again. We have, I'm not counting, but we have a really great representation here. And we actually have very few people who can't make it today. So we're going to jump in. Catherine is going to get us started. And then we'll take it from there. But welcome to the second session of the fourth roundtable of Square One on the status and state and future and of the social contract in America and how it applies to questions of justice. So, Catherine?
Yes, welcome to everyone. It is great to see you all here again today. Again, I'm Catherine Huffman. I'm the Executive Director here at Square One. It was such a pleasure to start getting to know all of you last week, and we're really looking forward to digging in on our first two discussion sessions for this roundtable today, focused on justice and the social contract. So I'm going to start out with just a few quick reminders and updates before I hand us over to our facilitator, Jeremy Travis, who will remind us where we've been and introduce a few newcomers and get us started. So first, a couple of reminders about events coming up. Next week on Tuesday, August 18th, we wanted to let you all know that Square One will be participating in a side event, a virtual side event at the Virtual Democratic National Convention as part of the Rabin Respite Convention series. So we hope you'll join us, and several of your colleagues here at the Roundtable today, Bruce Western, Emily Wang, Danielle Allen, Suki McMahon, and a couple of others will be leading us in a conversation titled Justice on the Trail, the Future of Justice and Democracy. Our colleague Madison is going to post the registration link in the chat box now, so you'll have that right now, and we'll also be forwarding information to all of you, so we hope you can join and that you'll share with others. Second, and just as important, a reminder that at the close of our session today, for anyone who's able to stay on for a little bit longer, we're looking forward to an informal virtual happy hour together where we can just talk informally and get to know each other a little better. No pressure at all. This is not required. You have not committed to this, but if you'd like to stay online for an extra few minutes, please do. Kids, pets, partners, anyone else in your near vicinity are welcome to join you on your screen as well. So if folks are able to stay on, we invite you to do that. So now a little bit of housekeeping for today's session. Today we're going to be beginning our work together, digging in on some important topics. First, Elizabeth Hinton will provide a historical perspective on social change and the social contract in the US, looking particularly at what we can learn from the past half century or so. And second, David Garland will share his insights on what we can learn about making change to our own system of justice in the US by examining the justice systems and other social systems in some other wealthy countries with a comparative look. So for each of these approximately 1 hour conversations, our paper authors will start us off by talking for just about 10 minutes to give us an overview, and then we'll move into a group conversation. For the authors, Elizabeth and David, our Square One colleague Madison will be our timekeeper today. She'll send you little time checks during the course of your 10 minutes, so you'll know how far along you are. Those will come in your chat box. And then after each of you starts us off, we'll take a quick moment for any clarifying questions directly to the authors, but then we'll move into a group discussion, which we hope and expect will be free-flowing as it was at the end of our gathering last week together. So for that discussion, just a quick reminder for everybody about how to get into the queue. Jeremy will be facilitating us, and he'll be calling on us in the order in which we sort of raise our hands in the queue. I think Suki's gonna post this. Suki, are you gonna post the instructions again? Yes, there it is, the magic of Zoom. As you can see there, if you have something you'd like to contribute, just go to the participants button at the bottom of your screen, click on raise your hand, and you'll be joining the queue. You'll be coming into the queue on Jeremy's screen, showing up in the order in which you raised your hand, and so he'll be moving through that. But as Jeremy explained to us last week, if you have an urgent comment that needs to come in response to something right away, something that won't make sense if you don't get to jump in quickly or that really is important to that particular moment in the discussion, you're welcome to do that. You can just do that by getting Jeremy's attention ideally by physically waving your hand. We're all on a screen. Jeremy can see all of our faces, and so he will almost certainly see you doing that. You can also send a private chat message, but the hand waving is better because I happen to know how much he focuses on the faces before him in the screen, and that will be a good way to do that. So with that, I will just say welcome again. It's really great to see you all. And I think, Jeremy, are ready to go ahead and get started.
Great. So let me again add my welcome and my thanks to everybody who participated in the first session last week. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, the session was recorded and is posted on the Square One YouTube channel. And it's really a rich, deep, far-ranging discussion that we had. And as happens often in these types of meetings, even if it's not on Zoom, we lose a lot of the nuance and the complexity and the substance just because things happen so quickly. So I encourage you, we also keep a transcript, but I encourage you if you want to just spend some time reliving this experience, we have that luxury because we are connected this way. This is an advantage of our technology. The second thing I'd like to do is just to remind you where we are in the longer process. So we're meeting every week at this time, and really impressed with the turnout, and the turnout last week was great. And in each of these sessions, as Catherine laid out, we will have a paper presenter who gets 10 minutes to sort of talk about summarizing their paper or what they would like us to take away from it, and then a discussion, starting with clarifying questions, and then a discussion that I will facilitate around that paper. It's not an academic conference. We're not responding to the paper. We're responding to the ideas that are put into the conversation by the paper writer. And of course, the paper matters because we're framing up some very big topics here. But my goal as the facilitator is to keep things moving quickly so that we can cover as much ground as possible, get as many ideas into the mix as possible, and to the extent that we have some back and forth and maybe some disagreement, that's a good thing. And we want to encourage people to be respectful and direct and constructive in their comments. And of course, to keep them terse and short. You did great last time. I was really, really impressed with this group in the sense that we were able to give everybody voice. And we'll try to do that again today. No guarantee, but we'll do our best in that regard. We meet again next week, and we have another session very much like this one, three papers on various elements of the social contract. Then we meet once again, and then we meet once again. So we're on a journey together. And today we're focusing on these two issues of history with Elizabeth Hinton's paper and the comparative look at the social contract with David Garland's paper getting us started. A couple more housekeeping things, if you don't mind. Do get my attention if you want to intervene in what we call the urgent wave. And please just be respectful of others. And if I make some motion like this, that probably means time to cut it off and move on. We have a lot of time to be together and a lot of air time for everybody. So let's realize that we have some people who have joined us for the first time, and we want to give them a moment to introduce themselves. But I want to thank you to those people who made some contributions by email after the last session, and just to thank them and to recognize some of the afterthoughts. A lot happens after we leave our time together. Hetty Lee suggested, good academic that she is, things we could read, homework to look at. There's great articles that will elevate some of the points that were made last time. My favorite one was on the social contract as property, particularly white privilege as property. So take a look at Hetty's recommendations. Kima Joy Taylor made some suggestions that we think about the difficulty of bringing equity into our conversation about the social contract and the sacrifices that people should make in order for the social contract to be actionable. Great suggestion. And Marcia Ricon Gallardo did something that we did at the end of last session. Remember that we did this little exercise of asking people to nominate something that somebody else had said as something to hold on to that was new to them, as opposed to going back to what they had said before. And Marcia, after last time, said, in reflection, I want to lift up two contributions of others, which is just a very generous sentiment. I like that a lot. One was Ananya's recognition of the original peoples of our land. That conversation, that observation was made a number of times last time, and it is and remains worth our continuing recognition of that. And Marcia, I thank you a lot for that. And Chaz Moore, who made a lot of very important contributions last time, Marcia wanted to just remind us what he said about the importance of youth-involved voices, those who are system-involved, young people, leadership potential, and who's really driving a lot of the movement these days, and the risk of overly concentrating on systems as opposed to people. Sorry about that. That one will disappear. We have some people with us today who could not make last session. We have one person, colleague, who couldn't make it this time, and that's Deanna Van Buren, had another obligation. I also want to acknowledge that we have a couple of observers with us, Jasmine Sandelson from the Columbia Justice Lab, who's here and is doing a lot of writing about Square One, and Nancy Fishman from the Schusterman Family Foundation is joining us, is a funder, and we're grateful for her contribution and for her years and years of work on justice reform. So I'm going to name 5 people who are with us today. I think they're all here, and ask them just to say their name, their institutional affiliation, and just one sentence, I really mean it, one sentence of what draws them to this particular topic. So that's a challenge: name, institutional affiliation, and what brings you to this topic, so that we can just get your voice in play, since you weren't able to join us last time. And those people are Amara Jones, Veshel Weaver, Danielle Allen, Fatima, Lauren Dreyer, and Aswad Thomas, who has joined us for the first time. We're grateful that you could join us, Aswad. But let me start with Amara Jones. And looking at the screen, and is Amara here? If so, the floor is yours.
I apologize, Jeremy. Amara let us know she will be an hour late, and also Danielle's having trouble entering. I will get her in immediately.
Okay. I saw Danielle's picture there. So
yeah, I did.
There she is. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Oh, now you're muted. Okay.
Spell. Sorry, but I am here. Apologies.
Hi, Danielle. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Yeah. So, and Veshel, we know is here because we already heard from her. But Veshel, what would you like to say about who you are, your institutional affiliation, and a sentence, maybe 2, what brings you to this topic of the future of the social contract in America and how it applies to justice? You're also muted. There we go. Yep.
Sorry. Thanks, Jeremy. I'm Veshel Weaver, and I'm at Johns Hopkins University. I'm a political scientist. And what draws me to this work is that I have long known that this is, and tried to theorize, that policing, that the criminal justice system, the carceral state, is a central aspect of what the state is and does, is a key feature defining American citizenship, is a key way that we come to know about government. And so I was told early on not to write about that wasn't a concern of political scientists, and I'm glad that I didn't listen.
Great. Love it, yeah. Danielle, welcome.
Thank you.
You are, and what brings you to this work?
So I am a political philosopher based at Harvard and director at the Edmund J. Saffer Center for Ethics. And it's hard to give a short answer to that question. I mean, everything Veshel said, I would put a check by. My first book was on punishment in antiquity, of all things, long time ago already. But I realized that I wrote that book, which is a project I got started on as an undergraduate at Princeton in the early 90s, because I had grown up in Southern California and over the course of the 80s just saw the massive growth of the carceral system around me. And I was, as an undergraduate, struck in reading the sort of literature on antiquity about the fact that they didn't use imprisonment. It seemed to be sort of non-existent in their courtroom speeches and so forth. There's like, you would never have known that such a thing existed. And I couldn't imagine a world, I couldn't believe there's a world that existed where prisons were kind of just growing and growing and taking up more and more space. And so I guess like just literally since then, I've been wanting to try to find a community of people who could collectively achieve an alternative to what we have. So this looks like that community of people. So I'm happy to be part of it.
Great. We're happy to have you. And Fatima, nice to see you. Fatima was a participant. She's a Roundtable veteran from our Detroit Roundtable. And
yes, hi there.
hi.
Good to see
So
you.
nice to see you. What brings you to this work, Fatima?
Sure. So hello, everyone. Fatima Loren Dreyer, recently married, Executive Director of the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention. We're a national network of hospital-based violence intervention programs. I'm also newly named Posen Commonwealth Fellow at the Yale School of Management. And what brings me to this work really is the paradigm shift of our time. And we really are at this particular moment with an incredible moment of global uprising. And I feel a particular responsibility to do our part to contribute to the realm of ideas and to really build, what are the alternatives? What is that infrastructure that we're imagining when we tear all this down, the carceral state and policing as we know it?
Well, thanks, Fatima. Wonderful to have you here. And thanks on that congratulations on that new appointment. And Aswad Thomas has joined us. And Aswad, give a sense of who you are, what you do, and what brings you to this work.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you all for having me. Aswad Thomas. I'm the Managing Director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, a flagship project of the Alliance for Safety and Justice. CSSJ is a national network of crime victims across the country. And what kind of led me to this work is I'm also a victim of gun violence. Like many crime victims across the country, the criminal justice system and traditional victim services, we've been left out of the conversation, out of policy making, out of programs, out of funding. So being able to organize crime survivors across the country to make sure that we have a voice at public policy making tables, but also influencing programming and funding at the state level.
Thank you, Aswad. Thank you for joining us. And this gives me a chance to say that your participation in an earlier Square One event has stuck with me ever since. And so I commend it to everybody to take a look at Aswad's remarks on another occasion. So we're now about to jump into our work. Just to see if there are any questions, let us know through chat. But I'm ready to get going, and I hope that you are as well. So again, the drill is we'll turn first to Elizabeth to take 10 minutes or so to say whatever she thinks will spur conversation in this group, since she already knows who we are and knows what we're about. And it need not be a summary of the paper, but could be. We don't know. And as you know, she's asking this really heretical question about this sort of almost what if our country had taken a different turn years ago and had taken community participation seriously. She'll do that for 10 minutes. I will pause to ask for clarifying questions, and then we'll open it up to whoever's on the queue. If you want to react, please get in the queue. The assistant wave gets you in more quickly. And we'll move pretty quickly. It'll feel like we've been moving quickly through this because it's a big topic, but that's how we put a lot of things in our pressure cooker, hoping that they'll generate some light. So the floor is yours, Elizabeth, if you'd like to take it away.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. And thanks also Bruce and Catherine and Suki and Evie and everybody who helped make this possible. It's really wonderful to be here. And I'm gonna try to be as brief as possible because I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And I do think there's a lot of really important overlap between some of the issues that I'm raising in my paper and also David's paper. So I think it'll be a lively and important day. I wrote this just like I think most other paper contributors in the pre-COVID world. So this was back in February or March. And after COVID and after George Floyd, these issues about community representation and the policy precedent of maximum feasible participation seemed even more urgent to me. And so I turned parts of this into a New York Times op-ed that's again kind of propping up maximum feasible participation as this really important policy precedent. So last week, many of us raised some skepticism about the idea of the social contract, and if that contract ever really extended or was meant for poor people and people of color, and which raises the question: is this system broken? Is mass incarceration and our problems with policing and punishment the result of a system that doesn't work, or is it working exactly the way that it's been designed? And I think since the election of Donald Trump, at least I'm a historian, so increasingly among historians, there are new discussions kind of pushing back on this narrative of the US history as one of kind of continued progress, and rethinking it as something that's always been about punishment, that's always been about repression. And I think, a lot of our work shows just what a tremendous policy failure mass incarceration has been. And in my own work that this draws from, which this work is part of the research I did for my my first book, which is called From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime: The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. And it's a history of federal crime policy from the Kennedy administration through the Reagan administration. When I started doing the work in the early 2000s, many people had kind of located the rise of mass incarceration in the Reagan administration in the 1980s. And, as I began to do the research looking at these federal documents, my primary source base was the White House central files of these administrations. I kept on having to go back and back and back to the source all the way to Kennedy, which is kind of surprising, right? We don't typically think of, the moment of the war on poverty and the civil rights revolution as also being the moment where policies were introduced that fostered the widespread criminalization of targeted low-income communities of color, which I argue is largely a response to the threat of demographic transformations and urban uprisings happening in many cities at this point. But so the question is of in the midst of all these repressive policies, and I get asked this a lot, like, what are the things that worked? What are the things that we could turn to that might help us think about transformation in the future? And this concept, as critical as I am of the war on poverty and the Johnson administration in my book, the concept of maximum feasible participation is a really, really important policy precedent. That means that, when we talk about community-based alternatives, we don't have to, it's not pie in the sky things. This is a program that the federal government supported. And basically, the centerpiece of the early war on poverty was this idea that structures many justice reform movements today, particularly those founded and directed by formerly incarcerated people, which is that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So during the first year of the war on poverty, Congress introduced this principle of maximum feasible participation, which allowed the federal government to begin granting autonomous grassroots organizations funding directly. So the federal government kind of bypassed the states and gave millions of dollars in grants to community organizations like the Woodlawn Organization in Chicago and the Syracuse Development Organization and Mobilization for Youth in the Lower East Side, and basically said, you know much better how to respond to the problems of poverty than we do in Washington. So, we're entrusting you to solve poverty, and we're going to take taxpayer dollars to support you in that process. This idea and community action programs end up being discussed as kind of the main steering force of the war on poverty, but really this direct kind of funding channel only lasted for a year. From 1964 to 1965, and by 1965, 1966, especially in the aftermath of rebellion in places like Watts in Los Angeles in 65, local officials really bristled at this, right? Because the problem when you're giving millions of dollars to poor people, this kind of vision of governance really does threaten, right, to undermine longstanding systems of racial hierarchy. So eventually, policymakers fought back, and increasingly, these grants were tied to municipal officials and civic organizations and police that became involved in implementing these programs. So for many organizations, if they wanted to receive funding, they had to have some kind of municipal oversight, which, as we know, can really compromise the programs themselves. So the root for me, the root of some of these shortcomings in these policies has to do, of course, with policymakers' own racism, with the emphasis on kind of behavior as being the root cause of poverty, rather than socioeconomic exclusion and systemic racism. And, as such, the war on poverty was limited, even though it has this, sexy terminology, but it wasn't a major structural intervention. Johnson and others believed that Black pathology was the root cause of Black poverty. And so the idea is, okay, we can actually fight Black poverty cheaply because, the kinds of programs that are necessary are self-help programs, remedial education. The war on poverty was not a job creation program for poor people, but the war on crime that Johnson then launched in the second year of the war on poverty became a job creation program for police. So I'm kind of all over the place, but this really important, as Jeremy introduced, this, going back to the 60s, this is a really important kind of crossroads in domestic policy, that these twinned domestic programs, one is warring on poverty, one warring on crime, were at the center of domestic policy, and eventually the crime war is what ended up winning out and what ended up getting implemented. And we can think about what, again, this is how I end the piece, what the U.S. would look like if policymakers got behind the war on poverty and this idea of empowering marginalized communities with the same kind of length and level of commitment and resources that they've dedicated to the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on gangs, throughout the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to discussing.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Perfect launch for a good discussion. So we always ask if there are clarifying questions, something that didn't quite come across in ways that you could understand what Elizabeth meant. And you can do that just by waving at me. Otherwise, we'll start. Yep, Heather.
So I apologize, Jeremy. I'm not sure whether this is counts as clarifying or not, but they're questions. So two, related to the example that you gave, Elizabeth, in the programs that were funded in 65 to 66. Were there any signs even within that year of outcomes from those programs? And I'm also wondering, just overall for your theory, what would be metrics of success?
Well, I think from many of the residents' perspectives, they had been registered to vote. They had successfully challenged landlords with the help of groups like the Syracuse Development Organization. So ostensibly improving their conditions. Community programs were launched for youth. I mean, I think it's also, because the program was so short-lived before it became essentially, these programs became more institutionalized and more tied to civic organizations and in some cases to the police. It's part of the point is they weren't ever really given the chance to work before many of these local officials felt as though their power was threatened. And what was the second part of your question? Sorry, I think.
I'm just wondering, like, overall for the theory to work, like, how would we measure? So if we were to pour resources in, as you're suggesting, to community-based or to the community itself, how would we know if it was working? What metrics would you use to define that?
Well, I think talking to people in the community and seeing how they're responding to this investment. I think the other thing is that, we have to be prepared to be patient, and we have to be prepared to have some of these kind of change not always, demonstrate success maybe by traditional metrics. Certainly with respect to, crime control programs on the other end, many field programs that didn't succeed in reducing crime were continued to be funded. I think one of the ironies behind this is that, those community-based crime prevention programs that did receive federal grants into the 70s, like tenant patrol organizations and community block watches and things like that, were much cheaper than the policing programs that the federal government supported, and did have a measurable impact on crime, yet consistently across region, across city, these community-based efforts were quickly defunded. So, I think part of it is, and this is one of the points of the paper, elites, people in power, people who have control over these kinds of investments and funds need to trust that people in communities know what they're doing. And I think that there has been historically a real resistance to that, as if, outsiders have a better understanding of community problems than people in communities themselves. And that doesn't mean that there aren't different kinds of expertise that need to be brought to the table, but that we just need a different way of imagining, how to govern and what change, what success might look like.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So we're going to start taking questions from the queue. At this point, in the way this works, Elizabeth recedes, because this is not about her at this point. It's not about her paper. It's about how does her papers suggest questions and discussion. And remember, even though we've got half an hour plus or so, it doesn't feel like a long time. We're weaving a big tapestry here over our 4 weeks together. So it'll all make sense at some point. So any sort of first thoughts, and we have Ananya was first up. And David is next, triggered by Elizabeth's paper and her recommendation. And remember, at the end, we're going to ask Bruce, of course, to do his wrap up at the very end to bring all of this together. So, Ananya, you're up.
I thought I saw Chaz waving his hand earlier. Chaz, did you have you're fine? Okay. So I'm hoping that we're on first name basis here, so I'm going to say Elizabeth rather than Professor Hinton. I really enjoyed this paper. The paper speaks so much to the present moment. I love teaching about the community action programs, and I teach about them as almost a hinge of history. But they pose, the paper poses the question for us as to whether our present moment is that kind of hinge, or whether it is, as being commonly talked about, a portal. But it also raises the persistent question of whether or not the revolution can be funded, and what that therefore means. I have two specific comments that might also be questions related to the paper. So the first has to do with the ways in which community action programs morphed into something that we, and I say we who work with cities, in cities and communities, continue to have to live with, which is this thing called community development. So community action quickly became the mammoth poverty bureaucracy that is community development, and more specifically, of course, it became model cities led by Banfield. So that line is really interesting, and I guess the question related to this for Elizabeth as well as for the group is whether we see any political openings that might still linger within community development. The second point is has to do more with a longer arc of history. So in the work that I've done on these programs in Oakland, California, where I lived for many years, community action was preceded by a Ford Foundation program called Gray Areas. Oakland was the experiment city. But it's also those programs that morphed into community action and then morphed into the poverty bureaucracy model cities. But it is in that bureaucracy that emerged the Black Panther Party, that rose to power and established power in Oakland by seizing control of the poverty bureaucracies. So I'm very interested in how the Ford Foundation efforts at pacification, and I would call it that, actually sort of fell apart and were taken over for one glorious moment in Oakland by Black liberation movements. So again, there's a question there about political openings, hopeful questions.
David is up next, and we'll come back and ask Elizabeth to respond to anything she wants to respond to in this discussion. But we're directing our conversation to the group. Elizabeth's listening attentively, and David Garland is up next.
Great. So I thought this paper was super interesting. And I want to talk about maximum feasible participation, which was what you highlighted just now, but also one of the other issues about to do with the complications surrounding responding to the immediate problem of crimes in a community and the risk of blaming the victims that are involved there. You kind of referenced this in the paper quite extensively. So on maximum feasible participation, not all community groups, not all community action groups come with the same kind of politics, the same kind of legitimacy, the same kind of, I would say, progressive credentials. And so the question of which groups are to be funded and given authority to operate in this way becomes a key one. These are not democratically elected. They're singled out and selected for federal funding or state funding and so on. And, you know, my first response is to think there's a very powerful argument that says one reason the USA is so punitive, one reason the USA retains, say, the death penalty, is that we have in our political structures a kind of radical level of local majoritarian democracy. And when you allow very local people to decide things about, you know, who they elect as a prosecutor, who they elect as a state judge, who's on the jury, quite often you get politics that are not progressive in the least, that turn out to be the reverse. You could imagine community groups that claimed, you know, we're white militias working in Michigan, we should be funded too. So all the issues about the oversight, the involvement of, you know, public officials in community action that you identify as being kind of problematic seem at the same time to be linked to some kind of safeguard, some kind of sense of ensuring that the people who are being funded are not illiberal in their use of the fund. So that was one question about funding at that level and involving and participating. The other issue was really just to say how complicated and important I consider the issue that you talked about in the paper, where actually you were talking about the 1960s and how projects to bring about social and economic reform and kind of structural change to deal with the underlying problems that were causing crime and various social problems in Black communities particularly, they were displaced by a concern to police and to punish. And you kind of signaled, or you kind of gave a sense of a contemporary version of that by talking about Pete Buttigieg responding to his record as a mayor in South Bend and why it was that Blacks in that community were 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana. And you described his response as being, he justified it because that's where guns were and violence was, and that's where the police were sent, and this was the consequence. And you were describing that as a blame the victim approach, basically. So that's, for me, a really crucial issue in all of this, because we're constantly working with the sense that, look, the immediate victim might be the person who's just been mugged, or the person who's been raped, or the person who's been killed in a crossfire, and they surely should be provided with supportive, you know, prosecution and policing and so on. But you also want to say, actually, a lot of these gang members or offenders or adults who are now violent are themselves the victim, and Bruce Weston's work on this has been very important, that they themselves have you know, become prone to violent behavior because of the violence they've experienced in their upbringing and so on. And so what we need to do is respond to that deeper question with you know, structural change in the character of these neighborhoods, with violence control, with family support, with jobs and so on. But you know, the temporality of these responses are entirely different. That's to say that one can bring about a kind of response to a crime incident within the hour. You can bring about a change in the conduct of youth in that area only over generations, really, in terms of investment. The level of government that's involved is different. I mean, the mayors and city governments will respond with police. They can hardly respond with the kind of social and economic transformation that requires federal dollars and requires major input of resources. And bringing these two conversations together and thinking not in terms of, you know, victims and offenders, but in a more kind of complicated ethical set of questions and political set of priorities and requirements, that seems to me like central to what we're talking about here. And I found reading the paper that I was kind of thinking we just need to have more of a conversation about that, because it's more complicated than either blame the victim by punishing and controlling and policing, or invest in economic justice and solve the problem.
So provocative questions, those will linger in the air. Let me turn to Linda Zeller, who is in the queue next.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. So in the paper, when I was reading, I was struck by a couple things. One was maximum feasible participation. I represent a statewide philanthropy fund, and prior was the State Commissioner for Behavioral Health. And prior to that, did healthcare for Michigan's prisons. So in my current role around philanthropy, I really think this paper has me thinking about what do we need to do this time to try to get the maximum feasible participation so that it really is the, and I'm quoting from your paper now, Elizabeth, autonomous and self-managed organization that is competent to exert political influence. So it feels to me like the learning from history that you raised for me in this paper is that somewhere along the line, we decided that municipalities and other existing sort of systems could be that entity that helps provide for maximum participation. And in fact, that was sort of a fatal flaw in my opinion. So as a philanthropist, we're extremely interested in trying to find a way to get maximum community participation. The challenge is community is defined there's just no consistent way to define that community. So when you're trying to invest, it's so dynamic. And so if this amazing think tank of people could help inform how we move forward with those types of investments when there is an ability to invest either financially or in empowering people with authority and ability to control their own environment, resources, and destiny. So I don't have an idea to fix it, but it really got me thinking. So thank you for the paper. Appreciate it.
So I'd like to just encourage a discussion that represents our colleagues on the screen who do community level work. So just note who's jumped in already. We have academics and funders, because this is an issue that has come up in Square One. Every roundtable we've had, because we make efforts to have strong community voices, community activists at the table, and it comes up certainly in the political discourse of the day. We talk about defund the police and where does money go, who controls the money, for what purpose, and how do we think about what might be other ways to produce safety. So this is a central question of the day, of the moment, of the day, literally. And I think we're onto something here that would benefit from hearing from those who do community level work. And I'm not going to call on anybody other than to say that Chaz had a lot to say last time. So if you're so inclined, I'd love to hear from you, or others who are really on the front line of community engagement and activating. Christiane, you're up next, and then Fatima. Yep.
Yeah, so speaking as a community organizer and activist on a variety of social justice issues,
I think something to keep in mind is, while the ideal to directly invest in community-based programs and services and so forth, and making sure that we're properly identifying those marginalized communities that need those resources and that are better interconnected to distribute those resources. Something that I think needs to change on an institutional level in every sector where there is an hierarchy is looking at leadership. If you're with a foundation or an organization or an institution, looking at the boards, the directors, supervisors, anybody that's in some sort of leadership position, if there is not true inclusion and diversity there, that's a problem. Doesn't matter how many community organizations, how many community groups might be receiving some level of funding or resources. If you're not changing the whole dynamic of institutional representation, especially in how it perpetuates racism, we're going to still see the same, issues at the end of the day. So another thing to keep in mind too is, even when you eventually diversify your leadership and your boards and so forth, and you identify the community groups that you want to support and fund, a lot of these community groups at the end of the day feel exploited because they fit an image that the organization or the institution wants to portray. And so keeping that in mind, that you are truly being inclusive, you are truly being considerate, you're truly being supportive of these communities and what their needs are. And I think a huge part of that too is not just doing your homework and identifying these, but doing regular assessments and regular evaluations where you're providing that oversight that needs to happen.
Thanks very much, Christiane. Fatima, and then Chaz, and then Donna. Thank you.
I want to echo a point I think, Elizabeth, you raised here about, we're burdened in some ways by these questions about, well, how would it look in reality, right? We're talking about dynamics of power and how do you avoid reifying systems at a local level. David, I think I heard you say, with new players who are dominating and aren't actually equitably and with accountability supporting what needs to happen at a local level. And what's hard about those questions, I think, is we've not tried in earnest ever to do it in the first place, right? In a way that brings it to scale, in a way, like, can we give people a space to fail and to learn and to be reorganized with a set of values? And I think this is, this piece, like, how do we bake into investment, restorative accountability? How do we bake? Well, we've learned a lot over the last few decades about those sorts of things. And it's not to kind of make this, the ideals that we imagine for these structures. Let's anticipate that there will be failure. How do we bake that in? And how do we adjust when failure, and let's be surprised about the places where there's innovation. I think that, I'm fascinated by, the startup community and venture capital, and this idea that you invest big in big ideas, you empower people, you set up structures, you advise, right? There are these ideas, and with enough grassroots infrastructure, people iterate. And what does it mean to iterate in a way that allows communities to try things, invite others to participate, and to adjust and iterate as they grow? And this question's about, well, how do we evaluate it? Well, we've learned a lot about participatory research. We've learned a lot about how to shift power, how to listen to those who've been most impacted, right? Those sorts of processes. I, someone who's kind of involved in the trauma-informed movement, thinks about this at local levels, how to inform local processes and recognize that oftentimes when we are actually, we look with a microscope at some of the dynamics that play out in communities, they're often based on a scarcity, on a lack of resources, and frankly, tremendous amount of trauma. Like those who've been impacted and there are supports that can be provided at particular units of development in local communities that I think are really compelling. People are trying this out all over the country and the world. So I want us to be bold in imagining and not be caught up by they're very good questions, but I think that we need to give people space and to talk first about investment and then about what it looks like.
Great, excellent. So we have an active queue, and we have some members of our group who are wondering, where did all those blue hands come from and how do I get mine up there? So we're going to take a moment for Suki to do a little reminder tutorial on what it takes to get in the queue. And then I think I had Donna next and then Chaz.
Yeah, so also I think from the perspective of a community.
Let me ask you just to hold 1 second. Suki, do you want to come in just to?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, tell people what they should do on their screen.
Sure, yes. So just if you'll go down to the bottom of your screen in Zoom, you'll see a button labeled participants. You'll click that and then click raise hand in the participants box. And on the host end, we will see your hand raise and what order it comes in.
Hey, Jorge, great.
Yes. And when you're done speaking, you can also lower your hand, but I'm also managing that as well.
Great.
That's all.
Okay, and so the queue we have now, and this will be all we can do before we ask Elizabeth to give some reactions to what she heard, and then we move on to our next paper. The queue we have now, if I've got it right, is Donna, Chaz, Jorge, Marcia, and Vesla. I think that's it. And if I missed anybody, I apologize, but I think that's it. So Donna, you're next.
Yeah, so as a community organizer, also as an activist and as someone who has run for local political office, like I feel that, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
I just said, right. I'm always impressed by people who take the plunge, okay.
I think that it is really critical to elect activists into public office. And I think a lot of people have a lot of reservations about that, but I think honestly, it is really the way to empower the people who are closest to that struggle to make some real political change in a way that it's kind of bringing that kind of outside the box thinking into institutions, right? And I think that what is important about doing that is to not get caught up, first of all, in cults of celebrity, which I think really pollutes our political participation in this country. And we tend to do that. We have these local activists who I think people get wrapped up in who they are and not so much in what they offer in terms of bringing transformative change to our communities. So I think, you know, kind of mobilizing the community around people who can bring real political change, who have really intimately experienced some of the problems that they're offering to solve. That is really crucially important. I think also you have to move those people out of there. I mean, I think it's human nature when you are then put into a position where you can become complacent, you do. And the systems as we have built them, I think they are vulnerable to that. And so insofar as, or for as long as we have the systems that we do, I think it's important to move people in and to move them out. But, you know, as a community organizer would, I think part of the responsibility of that person who's moved into that position is to continually engage in the community as they had, as activists, as organizers, and to basically organize themselves out of the job, right? So that's what we aspire to do as community organizers. We should be cultivating leadership among activists and organizers to replace us in those systems. And I don't think that this is unique to elected office. I think this is it's also something that we should see happening. I think it would be very valuable to see it happening in other institutions as well, in academia, in the nonprofit industrial complex, in all of these places.
Great. Thanks, Donna. Chaz and then Marcia.
Man, I'm like, I started here and then people kept talking and bringing up other stuff. So now I'm in like this other place, but I'll try to compact it a lot. One, I want to go back to the funding piece. before, you know, we were in a place and positions where we were getting grants and funding. I didn't understand how it worked, but now that I know how it works, like, I think, you know, philanthropy needs its ass kicked just as much as we're talking about policing and education and prisons, because they perpetuate very much of, you know, the white supremacy, the privilege, and all the things that, you know, like, that we're fighting against. They perpetuate it very much so, even in ways that it causes us, you know, the advocacy groups, the community groups, to compete with one another, right? And our approaches to the work are now going against one another. And I think it's enough money out there for us to be able to do the work the way we need to. But philanthropy just has to radically change how it gives that money out. One. Two, like, you know, I'm really still struggling with, you know, trying to get people on board with my idea. I feel like I'm the only person on this arc at this time of, like, I really think, as we're talking about rebuilding and transformation, somebody said it earlier really beautifully. Like, I think we have to allow that space for innovation. I think it was Fatima. You know, because the place where we're going, the only place I've seen it, in my, at least, you know, in my mind, is like in a Bell Hooks book or a Toni Morrison novel. I've never, it doesn't exist in the real world, right? It does, like, you know, this place where, you know, like, women can make a rap song and it not be the end of the world, because men have been doing it for decades. Like, we haven't been to that place. So, you know, like, even today I was talking to somebody about, well, like, what does a world without police look like and defunding look like? I was like, well, I don't know, but, you know, like, that's okay not to know what that looks like, because we're all going to have to collectively come together and build that world. And also, you know, again, I'm going to keep saying this, like, tearing down white supremacist institutions mean nothing if we keep the white supremacist ideologies, right? Like, if we bring, you know, patriarchy, misogyny with us, it doesn't matter, right? So I think as much as we keep talking about the institutions and the systems, we have to, like, really let that go, and maybe not even have a word for, like, this new ideology, what we're talking about, because it needs to get to a sense of humanity and existence. And then I think another thing that Donna just brought up for me, was, while I agree we need to elect people, you know, that have been impacted by the systems and people that are closest to the problem, I also think we need to be aware that when we do elect people into these systems and institutions, that if we don't free up the institutions for people to actually bring that transformative change that they may want, it doesn't matter, right? Like, you know, we have a couple of great elected folks here on council, maybe one or two. Jorge might disagree with that, and Christian, but it's only so much they can do because the way the system is set up and designed, right? And that's why I think so badly, you know, when we talk about square one, and the reason I like this space is because I think we need to think boldly, and boldly to me means maybe like rewriting the Constitution to make it actually be inclusive of everybody in all, and really just kind of restructuring who we are as American society today, because we're not the same. We're not allowing ourselves to be the same who we were, because we very much are still the same. But, like, now, because, again, of the leadership of Black women, women of color, queer folks, we're saying, something has to give. And I think we have to really reflect that systemically to make sure that, you know, we can still, because it's really nothing wrong with having a representative in council, but if they're not able to operate to the wills and in ways of how the people want, then we just frustrate ourselves, right? So it's just like, how do we get people that have been impacted in positions, but how do we also not set them up to fail?
Right.
Solid, yeah. Jeremy, thank you for cutting me off.
Well, your mind is going, and that's a good thing. I can see it. You said it at the outset. So we've got a very active queue. No surprise. Marcia, Jorge, Veshla, and then I know that Bruce was there somewhere. So we're going to extend our time a little bit, if you don't mind, to 5 minutes after, then go back to Elizabeth, and then on to our next paper presenter. But Marcia, if you could give us some, as brief as you can, comments about what you've heard so far, what's prompted in your thought process here.
Sure. So can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
So I wanted to respond to the first paper by Elizabeth. Really exceptional. I really appreciated reading about maximum feasible participation myself as a community activist early on in my life, particularly in Native American and Latino communities in the country. It seems to me that we're still talking about structural racism, though, that given that, you know, were we talking about residents or citizens' participation, the differentiation for a lot of immigrants, what that means, even though that for Native American and lots of Latinos, they're born here, but still, when you talk about elections and who are elected officials, and then who are elected to be systems players, the administrators of systems, it was never people that looked like us. And so for them to be the ones making decisions about what the system needed and what it didn't need, and even most recently in my comments that I made earlier, when we only rely on systems people, so foundations pouring year after year after year money into systems leaders and building their leadership to be better leaders to reform the system, that was the moot point, because you know they were taught to have a hammer and a nail, and that's all. And so they were going to always come at this system with that perspective in mind. They never included the people most impacted, those people from the community. You had to look at the data and then go to those communities and those neighborhoods where the data said that the people sitting in juvenile halls were coming from those neighborhoods, and go to those neighborhoods. But no one ever saw them as, you know, the experts or the officials, the administrators, to be able to say and or to give validity to what they were saying as appropriate ways to respond. And last but not least, yes, we use the word innovation, but I want to, with all due respect, I want to say something about how we as people, we had ancestors that never used pages to hold our youth or our adults to change their behavior. And so for us that still believe in our traditions and in our teachings, there's a wealth of beautiful information there that can be utilized to teach us about who we are, how to live our life, how to be as human beings, and not have this colorism and racism. And so when we say innovation, we always think like it's something out there that we've never done, as opposed to the fact that we have beautiful, beautiful ways of being that we just need to go back into our past to bring forth.
Great
so those
point.
were a few points.
Great, thank you so much. So our cue is now Jorge is next, and after him, I'll get it up in a second, is Veshla.
Thank you, Marcia, for the nod para la gente. I wanted to comment on the fact that maybe one of the first comments had to do with this paper, had to do with metrics, and had to do with outcomes. I think that one of the things that we sometimes, or that I know that funders or whatever, people sometimes lose sight of, or maybe aren't as easily impressed by or whatever, is the fundamental philosophical change that needs to occur before we can accurately measure anything. We sometimes, myself and some other radical organizers, we refuse to make the cost-benefit analysis when we go testify in front of committees that offer funding or whatever, if it's based on the argument that, look, if you have so many prisons and if you quit funding prisons, you can fund so many colleges, because the Koch brothers could come in tomorrow, fund all the damn prisons, and then what are you left with? You cannot simply make the argument on dollars. You cannot simply say, okay, you can come back with all these numbers, and if you can show that you can come back with these numbers, then we're going to give you so many dollars, despite the fact that historically we have raped and pillaged and exploited these same communities, and maybe they are deserving of some funds, and they are going to fail sometimes. They're not going to come up with the metrics that we want. They're not going to be able to prove something that maybe we can go back to Zuckerberg and say, look, give us half the money that you put into your yacht, right? For this city, please. And if you lose half the money that you give to your yacht, that's okay, right? That's okay. Because look at the people who are otherwise dead in that community. So I just want to say that I think that either we're going to buy into the idea, or we're going to actually push the idea or internalize the idea that those closest to the problem, that those communities for which these individuals have been pulled from, and these communities that we've devastated, deserve that funding, right? And that they're going to fail, and that, to refer back to something that Dr. Garland said, right, that this is not something that's going to happen right now, that it may happen over the course of a generation or two or 3 generations, that's okay. But that you're not going to get a return on your dollar tomorrow or next year, and that's okay.
Great. Thanks, Jorge. Veshla?
Thank you. So Elizabeth, I think the paper for me brought up, and this is maybe a question for you and maybe just a chance for us to think about where this can go. What you're talking about with maximum feasible participation is from the government, but as your work shows, as you know, Simon Balto and Max Felker-Cantor and others, and you know, some of the work I've been doing on the 1970s shows is that there are so many ways that communities without a precious little penny developed radical alternatives to safety deprivation, right? We didn't need, I mean, yes, maximum feasible participation is the core of your paper, but what it kept calling out to me is this robust, understudied, right? As academics, we don't know the metrics, we don't have the metrics because we never studied groups like 300 Gangsters in Baltimore. We never studied the Hood Claimers. We never studied the efforts in a particularly social scientific way of the Panthers, right? And their programs. We never studied the efforts and measured the efforts of Woodlawn, of all of the efforts from the 60s on forward of communities to actually propose something different and to give us an idea of safety grounded in communal knowledge, right? And so I just wanted to add to this that one of the biggest themes in my own Portals work, which is the biggest archive I think that's ever been collected of policing narratives by people who have been policed, one of the biggest themes, one of the biggest things they call for is exactly at the heart of your paper, which is self-determination, collective autonomy, and the right to design and implement their own notions of safety. And in many ways, the police themselves interrupt efforts to set up Black indigenous economies, to set up survival strategies. So in my own city, Baltimore, right, the police constantly are surveilling the squeegee kids, right? The kids who go and squeegee the cars for money, right? That is a Black, independent, informal economy and a means of sustenance. And I just wanted to, you know, read one little tiny excerpt to just, you know, underscore this. In this conversation between two people, they're talking about how none of the community centers that they relied on in their own youth, all of them had been shut down. And now somebody comes along and sets up an informal basketball court just to have a place for kids to play. And as soon as he sets it up, the police are circling the basketball court, right? Looking for them to get in a fight so that they can come in and surveil. And so I think one of the things that we need to bring to this conversation is the role of police themselves in limiting efforts, maximal feasible participation, and efforts by communities themselves to police their own, to provide safety, to informally set up structures of care and economic independence. And I see this again and again and again, the role of police in constraining the ability of communities to actually provide safety to one another.
Right. Thanks, Veshla. I just want to confirm that Bruce took his hand down. True? Yeah, okay. We have two more of our colleagues who want to come in before we come back to Elizabeth, Vivian and Gabriel. Vivian? Not quite sure what's going on here. Can't hear anything. Okay. Vivian, I don't know if you're working with your mute button or try one more time. No.
So Jeremy, she's muted.
She was,
we all are, apart from people who've unmuted themselves.
But then she's not. So we're going to ask Evie to work with you, figure this out, because we definitely want to hear what you have to say. So while we're doing that, we'll come back to Gabriel. Oh, there you are. Are you there?
Yeah, I fixed it.
Yay. Okay.
I didn't know my computer had two microphones.
The things we learn, right?
The things we learn, yes.
Yeah.
So a couple of things, like Elizabeth, I'm really interested to the point like of obsession right now about whether or not you looked at any of these community action programs or community development corporations that were developed outside of urban areas and what happened in those communities after the programs were shut down. And it's really a very specific and kind of personal question, because we had both on Long Island and Nassau County, we had community development corporations, the EOC, and we had community action programs in every town. And the funding did go away, but somehow, even when the funding got connected to the municipal county seat, nothing changed. I remember, because I was there, and I grew up in those community centers, and everybody that grew up in those community centers with me is the reason that my neighborhood is still able to force them to rebuild the park when the park is crumbling, right? The people I grew up with are like making it happen. That whole generation is making a difference because our program stayed the same right up until like 1973. Nothing changed in our community. It was a mix of, traditional civil rights organizations like the NAACP, plus the Panthers, plus other groups. Nothing changed. And has any study ever been done of the folks who grew up in that era, who were teenagers and young adults in that era, who participated in those programs? What are they doing now? And I think that's a really important question, because that's where your results are. And they may not have been immediate results, but the long-term implications are massive, because over time, these folks have made a difference in their communities. And the other thing I want to lift up again is this question of what funding looks like. We know that of all of the philanthropic dollars that are invested, very little is invested in first of all, in issues of defunding or reducing the size of the carceral system. And what is invested in that area is a tiny bit of that is directed at people impacted. But it's not just about the dollars. It is about the opportunity to fail and what are your measurements. If we want to say we want to tear down something that's not working, you can't do it under the capitalist structure, because the capital structure is going to look for a return on investment. And that's the problem. Like the revolution won't be funded under a capitalist structure. And that's the answer to that question. It can be funded if it's not under the capitalist structure, but if it's under that structure, it will always look to return on investment. And return on investment as defined by the investor, not by the people who are being invested in.
Vivian, I'm going to cut you off there to ask Gabriel to say what he'd like to say, and then get back to Elizabeth. We're a little out of behind schedule, and we want to give adequate time to David and his paper. So, Gabriel?
Elizabeth, thank you. A few quick comments. Number one is when we're talking both about funding, collaboration, and empowerment of communities, how have you seen the work of embracing the hybridity of the communities, right? So I'm thinking, I work with faith-based organizations, FBOs, and what those studies have. And by hybridity, I mean, I think David alluded to this, you know, in our communities, we have the kind of both the progressive and liberative and justice-oriented bent, but there's this internalized, I think Chaz spoke to that, colonization, hierarchy, patriarchy, right? And sometimes we want the autonomy and the voice of the community, but there's a kind of romanticizing of what that community is like, right? And so the community may have something else to say, and some of it is not liberative or justice oriented. And so how have we dealt with that collaboration and empowerment and funding, especially with, you know, I'm Puerto Rican and I grew up in El Barrio. A lot of those FBOs were longstanding, very liberative, very empowerment, but simultaneously very oppressive and very hierarchical. But they were there for 50, 60, 70 years. And so how do you partner with that hybrid community that helps and hurts, I think is a simple way to say that. The second thing is about, I appreciate what you had to say about process and time, right? I think there's something that needs to be said about time. What do we consider time, enough time commitment, and enough time in the process? Jorge talked about freedom to fail, or freedom to reinvent, or freedom to innovate, or to pull back from the best of our traditions, as Marcia said. I think that the question of process needs to be clearly defined when we're talking about maximum feasible participation. And the last thing I want to talk about is ingenuity and tradition. What does creating space for both tradition and ingenuity look like? Creating space. And I don't just mean physical space, although I do mean physical space, but time, reflection. My former life was as academic in Princeton, but now I work as a pastor of a church and of a coalition. And there's not a lot of space because we're putting out a lot of fires. So the ingenuity space has not been created. And how do we fund space for ingenuity? And again, thanks, Elizabeth.
Good point. So Elizabeth, you have 38 seconds to react. What a great conversation. I hope you're taking it all in and remembering it, and that it'll influence your work. But are there 2 or 3 points that you'd like to respond to before we move on?
Well, this has just been such a enriching and informative and mind-blowing discussion. So I'm still processing it and taking it all in. So thank you all very much for engaging with the work and all the points that you raised. I think this is a really amazing jumping off point for subsequent sessions, but also our conversation today, because I think one of the themes that keeps on coming up is how limited we are in our current economic system, but also our worldview and our frame of mind. And I think that these are some of the issues that David raises in his paper. And the danger here is, as we're trying to bring about a kind of transformation, how do we prevent reifying the very inequalities and hierarchies that we're challenging, especially when those are so ingrained in our society. Anyways, I have so much to say, but hopefully it'll end up coming out over the course of weeks. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, great. And that we just have to come to grips with the fact that we're not tying up any loose ends here. Even at the end of our time together, there'll be lots, but that's the point, is to keep things fluid and learn from each other, and to not come back and forth, trying to resolve anything, but it's really to develop the big tapestry that I mentioned before. So we're going to turn next to David. Before I do that, just a reminder, and I should have done this at the outset, we try not to use the chat function to message each other during the session, so that we can stay focused on what's happening on the screen and in the moment. We do ask people if they have things they want to share with people later, like there's a great article you want people to read, to do that in the comments that Suki contributes afterwards. Bruce, what are you holding up? What is that? But you're muted. I don't know what you're doing.
This is Danielle's publication, the link that she shared with.
Okay.
Yeah, so I know the rules now, so I'll send it
time.
So.
I had you in mind. I didn't want to sort of
No
make
worries,
the apology personal, but I had you in mind.
No, it's fine.
So good. So Bruce has actually illustrated your chat. There we go. That's pretty powerful. So David, give us 10 minutes of addition to this crazy brew we got going here.
So Jeremy, I do have a 10-minute summary of my paper. Would it be preferable just to skip that and go straight to general discussion in the interest of time? I don't mind either way.
I think it would be useful for you to frame up what you think, and if you can be a bridge from where we were to where we're going to be, that's even better. Okay. So there's not just continuation.
So here's a summary of what I think are the key points. I think all of them are pretty simple. In fact, I'm stunned by the extent to which most of these ideas, which I thought were insight, have just become headlines and slogans in the last few months. So I don't think I'm telling anybody anything they don't already know. So the paper argues that American criminal justice uses penal controls more extensively and more intensively than anywhere else on the planet. Other Western nations obviously use punishment, but they use controls less extensively. Their policing and punishment are less harsh and more humane. And what I try and suggest in the paper is that this is not just a question, although it is this too, of recurring policy choices. It actually reflects underlying durable social and economic structures, and in particular the political economy of the USA. Other affluent nations I'm claiming, and of course, by the way, here the comparison is a kind of optimistic one, as if the USA should be compared with other liberal democratic affluent nations. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe we should be compared with, I don't know, high crime nations or former settler societies, or I don't know, illiberal authoritarian nations. But if you compare us with Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, what I think is that these other societies are less reliant on harsh policing and harsh punishment. First of all, because the social milieu of poor people in these societies is less disadvantaged and less dangerous than is true here. And secondly, because states in these societies possess a kind of soft power and a social infrastructure that allows them to regulate and shape behavior in non-penal ways that aren't available to US government in the same way. The lesson that I take from this is kind of simple, but also rather somber. What I think it means is that without big structural change of the kind that Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders have been talking about, the prospects for ending criminal injustice are really quite limited in this country. Mass incarceration, warrior policing, just like high rates of criminal violence, have deep roots in America's political economy, and they're unlikely to disappear without wider socioeconomic transformation. So that's the overall thesis, right? The comparative points in the paper, made sometimes with some detail, usually with a broad brush, are that other nations obviously are dismayed by criminal events, that they regard, you know, offenders as people to be condemned, violence as something to be feared, public safety as something to be promoted. But the way that they undertake that process continues, on the whole, I mean, there's a lot of variation, to treat offenders as individual citizens whose social rights and even welfare state entitlements continue while they're being punished. In contrast here, we have this kind of war mentality that individual offenders basically lose their liberty interests, are to be regarded as dangerous and to be, you know, subjected to whatever kind of continuing controls the public feels safest to impose. The claim I'm making is that this is true not because European nations are more civilized, not because they don't have a tendency to be punitive or racist, but rather because they have in place economic arrangements and welfare states and forms of political association that are more egalitarian and more inclusive, and which have the effect of reducing the need for penal control. So one of the things I want to emphasize, and often enough when we talk about punishment and policing in the current context, especially after a long-term reduction in crime and violence in this society, we tend to forget that even now, the USA continues to be a remarkably violent place. In terms of homicide rates, America's homicide rate continues to be 3 times as high as Canada's, and between 5 and 10 times as high as Western European nations. And of course, these rates are much worse if you focus on communities of color, African American youth. But even if you think just about white people, they're killed at a higher rate here in the USA than any of these other countries. And we think about guns, but if you think about non-firearm homicides, they're higher in the USA than in any of the comparable countries. So basically what I'm suggesting is we need to focus on the USA as a high violence society. We also have to remember that that's not the only social problem where the USA comes bottom of the league. Basically, child poverty, relative poverty, poverty while in work, infant mortality, teenage birth rates, mental illness, high school non-completion, drug addiction, drug deaths, all of these are higher in the USA or worse in the USA than they are elsewhere. And of course, nearly all of these problems are worse in minority communities than in general. So why is this the case? What are the structural sources of violence and disorder in the USA? And what the paper suggests is that if you look at comparative research, it suggests that societies that are more unequal and societies that have less generous, less comprehensive welfare states are prone to have higher rates of violence and higher levels of punishment than more equal, more generous societies. And of course, on that scale, if you look at America's political economy, its equality, its welfare state, it's no surprise to find that levels of violence in this country and levels of punishment in this country are so high because we are the most unequal of these societies and have the least generous welfare state for the poor. So that the claim is that America's political economy, its labor market, and the lack of poverty reducing effort by the government ensures that the risks that markets impose are left to lie where they fall, and that individuals, families, and communities are less secured against market risks than is true in any of these other countries, which means that the work of the important work, which I kind of emphasize in the paper, of socializing and raising and integrating and controlling individuals that kind of goes on a routine day-to-day basis, that's less successfully done on the whole in many of these communities, with the consequence that we have more disorder and more dislocation and margins in which illegal economies, violence and crime prosper. So there's a section in the paper where I talk a lot about this, it's important to remember that when we talk about inequality and poverty and lack of welfare provision and crime, it's not because most crime is, like 19th century crimes of poverty where women are stealing to feed their families. That's not the relationship between poverty and inequality and crime we're talking about. The problem is really, and the emphatic important problem is one of violence in this country. And violence is complex, and violence has all sorts of social and psychological and environmental triggers and formative and developmental processes. But what I'm claiming in the paper, and what I think is borne out by the research, is that in societies and communities where the families and the employers and the schools and the communities that are charged with the kind of routine work of raising kids, socializing kids, integrating kids, and controlling kids, do a much less good job of that work, difficult work that always kind of is prone to going wrong in any kind of setting, if these families are stressed, if these families have few resources, if they have poor housing, if they have low levels of employment and less security, if they're, if both parents are working, if one parent is incarcerated, if there's just no resources to do that work, the possibilities of doing it, especially in a context where schools and employment and the background and formal controls of community are undermined by these circumstances, it's no surprise that levels of violence and levels of crime will tend to grow in these settings. And in the USA, that's exactly what we find. So where social order is fragile, what you find is that it ends up being the state and its control agency, the police, prisons and probation and parole, that move in and do more of that work. Where families and employers and schools are functioning better, law and order stays in the background. Law and order is for the aberrational case, not for the routine community. In America, we've got too many cases like the former. And by the way, just because, you know, talk about families and talk about social controls and talk about the social control deficit often seems like blaming the victims, as if, you know, there's a family values problem here. The key point to emphasize is that routine social control by families is enabled or inhibited by the supply of resources that the social system, the political system, the economic system provides. And in the paper, I talk about what these resources are, but basically, this is a political economy story that operates through the mediation of families and communities and schools and neighborhoods, and it ends up in individual violence. It's not a story about individual characteristics or even about family failure. Okay, just a couple of moments more. Welfare states, we think of it as being kind of tax and spending redistribution machines, but welfare states are also apparatuses that build infrastructures of social services and public health and educational provision and employment that basically provide an infrastructure that provides social support and social controls to aid families and community to do this work. And of course, in the USA, that apparatus is by comparison much less effective. Now we see this, what I'm really talking about is the kind of weakness of the social infrastructure in the USA. You see this in, you know, the response to the pandemic, not just in terms of leadership by, you know, the Trump administration, but in terms of the actual infrastructure of capable control that central government is capable of exerting at the level of individual behavior and family behavior. In this country, it doesn't exist in all sorts of places. And of course, it's always tripped up and opposed by the levels of government and the levels of kind of, you know, veto opposition by different parties and different politics in different places. This is a nation, a huge nation, that is governed very poorly in domestic terms, even when the administration is working well, not just when it's dysfunctional. So what tends to happen is that when we have social problems, when we have violence and crime, the default solution tends to be resort to harsh policing and penal control. And that's partly because of politics and partly because of the lack of value accorded to the lives of poor people and poor people of color in particular. But it's also a story about just capacity and what's available to government, particularly city government, particularly governments that would like to invest in communities but are faced with the need to control violence. And so what I'm suggesting on the whole is a rather kind of simple but rather somber conclusion, which is that basically if the USA is to move away from high levels of violence, move away from aggressive warrior policing, move away from mass incarceration, it won't be just because criminal justice movements and movements for criminal justice reform exist. It will be because these movements somehow manage to hitch themselves to and embed themselves within wider struggles for economic justice, for transforming the labor market, for building a welfare state. And of course, none of these struggles will happen because of crime and criminal justice. They'll happen because working people demand these things. But in the meantime, criminal justice activists can, you know, shape criminal justice thinking, crime control thinking in a way that accords with these transformations rather than seems separate from them. So for example, and I'll finish on this, we need to emphasize the whole time that punishment is not an efficient form of crime control. That punishment is necessary, that, you know, we have to impose some kind of punishment to do justice, to deter offenders, to contain dangerous individuals. But criminal punishment, if it happens at all, and most of the time offenders go unpunished, tends to be after the fact and tends to reinforce criminality and social exclusion rather than reform offenders. We should think of punishment instead as a kind of tragic necessity to be minimized, not a social tool to be deployed everywhere. We should remember, and this is the important point of the paper, I think, that real crime control, crime prevention, responses to criminal behavior, particularly at the early stages, that occurs in the mainstream routine practices of social control that's done by parents and teachers and neighbors and employers and communities, not by law and order activity. And that's precisely why other nations, other affluent Western nations, tend to, do without the level of punishment we have, enjoy lower levels of violence than we do, basically because they're supporting families and communities to socialize and integrate and ultimately to control generations of youth, not to expose them to kind of risk that we do. That's the paper, I think, in a nutshell. Look forward very much to hearing what your responses are. Thanks so much.
No, thank you so much, David. I'm glad we asked you to summarize and present it the way you did, and I think I speak for others just to say what a collection from Elizabeth to David of some big ideas at a moment in our country's history where we'd like to think that big ideas are in play in our political system, and maybe that's being overly optimistic. So we always allow for a little bit of time for people to ask clarifying questions, and I hope they are truly that. I want to privilege people who have not spoken yet today when we open it up, and I'm going to ask for Suki to help me on sort of calling out whoever, she has a list of those people who haven't spoken. It's a little hard for me to do that. We have about 25 minutes, so this is not enough time to take on a big topic, so I'm going to ask for really, really tight observations, and forgive me if I ask you to move it along if it's going on a bit too long. We have a lot to talk about. We want to get to Bruce's summary. We give David a chance to respond to any observations, and we're going to 6:15, just reminding people that we've extended to 6:15. So clarifying questions first, and this is not the cue, so just wave your hand at me if something was not clear in what David said or in his paper that you want to focus on. Seeing none. So Suki, help me out here with the privileging those who have not spoken first. I know Aisha has not, so we'll do that one next, and then you can just help me think about who might be next. And we'll get those done because I'd like to have everybody have a chance to say something, and then we'll come back to those who have already spoken before we wrap it up. Aisha?
There's a lot in that I want to talk about, but we have 25 minutes. So I'm going to try to zone in on one particular aspect, and I think you hit it towards the end, David, because in reading these two pieces together, I thought it was a great juxtaposition of like, what's the cart, what's the horse, what's the, how do we engage with this? And one of the pieces that I just want to amplify, sort of mimicking what we did last week, is the piece about any of the reform that we're doing or the revolution can't be separated. And so when we talk about criminal justice reform, to me, that was one of the strongest points that resonated that I just want to parse out. That economic justice and an overhaul of the child welfare system, an overhaul of all of these social sort of constructs that exist that impact the lives of our communities, however broadly you define that term or narrow, I think is really inextricably tied. And when we talk about violence and the rate of violence, we cannot separate those discussions from trauma and the generations of perpetuated trauma. And so I don't actually know what to do with this. And I've been struggling during the first section of how to take all of this in and chime in these really quick bits, because I want to do this talk for hours about this. But I would just say that I want to amplify this idea and this notion that if you're talking, if we're figuring out where do we go next in overhauling the criminal justice system, I don't think we can start the question there. It has to be much broader.
That is a central premise of this roundtable of Square One. Can't do that, criminal justice reform, without doing this. And there's a sequencing issue, obviously. So, Suki, I'm going to rely on the queue. And is Kima next? Is that right? I believe so. Okay.
We have Hedy, Kima, Aswad, and Elizabeth.
Great. Okay. Hedy's next. Thanks.
Thank you. So I too have been struggling with conversations, I think for similar ways as Aisha. But the other piece, we want individuals, families, communities to thrive, not just survive, not just be part of the criminal justice system. And that requires real thought and education in partnership with these other systems. What David said resonated so strongly with me. But one piece I've been struggling with, even as a lot of the criminal justice reform work has gone on, is that we're a very punitive nation. Even if we don't put people in the criminal justice system, when we look at the education system, who are we expelling and suspending first? When we look at the child welfare, as soon as people are using drugs, we take their babies away, and it's punitive in that system. So how do you reframe systems? And reframe systems really means we have to understand the intricacies of other systems. And one particular piece I've struggled with in the substance use space, and even to extend here, is people say, well, we'll take people out of the criminal justice system, which I completely believe in, and put them in Medicaid, in the healthcare system. But for the healthcare system, Medicaid is like the place we want to reform. We want universal healthcare. Medicaid isn't great. It has huge disparities. It's hard to get into, yada, yada, yada. And so it would be great. It's not only creating a shared vision, but it's making sure that we really, truly understand what the ideal goals are for each of those different sectors, so that we truly have and restructure the nation into having different communities thrive. Because sometimes we accidentally kind of take each other out and make another sector kind of take 2 steps back.
Great. Thank you so much, Kima. Perfect. And Hedy Lee is up next, and then Aswad.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this opportunity.
Eddie, I think it is actually Hedy was next, and then we'll figure out where you are in the queue. I know Hedy was.
I turned the video.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I think it's because it was Eddie and Hedy. Our names rhyme.
Yeah, a little confusing.
Sorry, Eddie. I'll be quick. One thing that I was thinking about from what David was talking about is this idea that inequality is killing us, but isn't it killing us all? I mean, so some of the we focus a lot on comparisons of African Americans and lower socioeconomic status groups, but I think at least the work in health inequality literature shows that if you compare even millionaires in the US to these other countries, I don't know if they're the perfect comparison countries as you alluded to, our health, or I'm not a millionaire, their health is also way worse, higher risk of mortality, more risk in experiencing violence as well. And so I'm just wondering how we should be talking or framing these discussions to ensure that when we're talking about violence in the United States, when we're talking about the social problems, that these are things that are impacting all of us, not just particular segments. So anyway, this is something I wanted to bring up, and hopefully you can reflect upon after everyone's asked questions.
Great. Continuing to move through our queue, Aswad is next.
Cool, thanks. That was a great article, David. Just an observation. When we think about the criminal justice system, we think about more policing. For the criminal justice system, victims of crime has played a lead role in that, and it's primarily have been victims of crime, that are often have one single victim experience, often as a white woman or a white male. And for the past few decades, crime victims in communities of color, from parents that lost children to violence to victims of gun violence themselves, to Black and brown women and men that are impacted by domestic violence and sexual assault, have been totally excluded out of the conversation, right? And when we look at criminal justice reform today, that still stands true of the majority of crime victims in those communities most harmed by crime and violence and incarceration are the least supported by these systems. And so until we actually, talk with crime victims about what makes them safe, we will continue to build a system that haven't been supported and don't meet the needs of crime victims. And we think about law enforcement, you think about politicians, they're always speaking on behalf of victims. And across the country, I sit on committee hearings and everyone's talking about the victims and speaking on behalf of the victims. But in those committee rooms, there aren't any victims of color who are at the tables. And so the important work of community organizers, the work that I lead, is to organize those survivors that have been neglected, that have been mistreated. And we think about the organizations who are on the front lines doing the work in community, there hasn't been an investment into the infrastructure and the capacity building of those organizations who have the solutions, who, when something of violence happened in the community, folks in the community aren't calling police. They're calling the organizations, the interventionist groups, they're calling the gang interventions, they're calling the mothers and fathers, the pastors that have lost individuals to violence, have started their own organization as a result of that. And so I think we have come a long way, but still today we got a long way to go. And the more that we don't include the voices of crime victims in communities of color, we're going to continue to have those challenges, whether that's through research, policy making, but most importantly, we can't not do what we've been doing for the past 30 years of not listening to crime victims in communities of color, and what are their priorities for the justice system. We'll see there's more intervention programs, trauma recovery centers, more investing in mental health treatment, which is what crime victims and communities of color want: more jobs, not just more policing. And the victims landscape for the past few years have played a lead role in advocating for tough on crime policies. And still today, there are those groups that are out there, and we see a shift, but we must continue to have the voices of crime victims at all policy making tables, and also shift the narrative in the media as well.
So the wonderful problem that we have is that everybody wants to get in right now. Not everybody, but many of you. This is a good problem for a facilitator to have. So I'm going to ask again for brevity. I'm going to ask Elizabeth, who's next up in the queue, just to hold a bit, if you would, so we can get people who have not yet made a contribution to the conversation. And starting with Courtney next, just whatever the punchiest points you want to make sure that we get your contribution. And then we'll see where we are. In the interest of time, we're going to have to close it out early, but I do want to make sure that we give an opportunity for those who have not said what they would like to say. And lots of people want to be in right now. Courtney, you're up. Elizabeth, please be patient.
So I'll try and make it as brief and quick as I possibly can.
Okay.
The thing that sort of kept coming up for me is this notion of fellow citizen, and the Mr. Smith, and sort of the treatment of people. And so that led me to think about, in what ways are we comparing ourselves to other colonized countries? And how are we reckoning with our own history of violence, and how that violence continues to perpetuate itself over and over and over again in our systems, and sort of maintaining how we understand violence and crime in our country. So I'll stop there so that someone else can jump in.
Very important. It links to our first conversation, which I like a lot. We can do that. Ananya Roy, you're next in the queue.
I've spoken before, so Elizabeth, I think, is before me.
Yeah, I'm asking Elizabeth, since she had a lot of airtime in the first session, just to hold on a little bit. I won't forget her, but I want to make sure we get new voices in quickly.
I appreciate that. I have a lot of questions about the paper, and I have concerns about how the paper frames certain issues related to the political economy of the US, but I'll be brief and mention two.
Please.
So my concern is that the penal control argument rests on an argument about fragile social order, which in turn is equated with racialized poverty. But what it elides is a system of predation. Some of us would call that racial capitalism, where there is the hoarding of wealth and power. The US is exceptional, not just in mass incarceration. It's exceptional, for example, in taxation policy. It's exceptional in its enablement of the looting of the economy by those who are at the very top of the economic food chain. And I worry that the paper elides that. The second is that there are many arguments in the paper that seem to be in tension with one another. And then what I heard David present is yet in tension with that, around the relationship between poverty, crime, violence, and policing. And that is, of course, central to the work we're trying to do. So I'm going to say that, of course, we know that there is no direct relationship between poverty and crime. We do know that in the US, policing creates crime. And that too is obscured in the paper. But I'm also going to say that we need a bit more time, not now, but in the roundtable to talk about violence, how we're thinking about it, and thinking about its relationship to what is being conceptualized as impoverishment, damaged environments is what the paper used. Those are all things that need much more discussion.
The topic of violence, we devoted 2.5 days to it in Detroit, very complicated. And this is obviously directly related to this discussion as well. So thanks for bringing that into our midst here. So the queue that I have right now, and let's see if I'm getting this right, is Emily, Christian, and then Elizabeth. And then if that'll take us to the point where we would normally ask David to react. And if that works out that way, that's great. But we might have room for one more. So Emily?
Great. Thank you. So, I have, similarly, I found that there were parts, David, where the paper, it was a tension. And in particular, I thought that there was a real tension between kind of an understanding and reflection of the structural issues that place people at risk, and then the kind of individual narrative that is like, these folks are at risk. They do things, the behaviors argument. I found that throughout. One place that I really wanted to unpack more with you, because I actually fundamentally disagree with this, is this sentence. And I think that this is a sentence that goes to the values. I know it's the 5th roundtable, but it's granted we need some level of punishment to deter would-be offenders, to impose deserved retribution on wrongdoers, to contain dangerous individuals, and to uphold the law. And to me, this is core of what we're talking about, of really thinking about how it is that we step back to a square one, is that issue of punishment, which I think is really distinct. We've been in other settings where we've talked to a colleague, Daniel Sared, about accountability of a justice system that holds people accountable but doesn't necessarily punish them. And it's in conversations with patients that have been incarcerated, that have been victims themselves, that are not necessarily looking to punish, but to hold individuals accountable. And that creates systems, I think, that are more kind of deeply humane. It's also, the health system, this is Takima's point, is also deeply punishing. And so if we end up in systems where punishment is something that we call normative, I think we're going to see us slipping back into the same kind of hierarchies and kind of oppressive situations in which we live right now.
Great. Love to hear more conversation on that, and maybe David will take it up as well. Christian, Elizabeth, and then Eddie. I realize that you're on the phone and can't raise your hand, so you'll get the last observation and comment before we turn back to David. Christian?
Yeah, I just simply wanted to emphasize, how these systems, especially that are punitive, do perpetuate racial inequity. It creates a cycle of debt, a cycle of poverty that people just can't get out of. And so I think as far as being more solution oriented in our conversations, I'd like to, for everyone to kind of emphasize how a lot of these issues not only intersect, but how a lot of the solutions to these issues are intersectional as well, especially pertaining to equity. I'll just keep it short like that for now.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Elizabeth?
Just building off some of what Courtney and Emily said, I just have 2 really quick things. The first is that I wondered a lot in the paper the ways in which the legacy of dispossession and genocide of indigenous people and slavery in the US, but also in the Western Hemisphere, profoundly shapes our notions of punishment. So I wonder the ways in which how we punish people compares to other countries that have a legacy of genocide of indigenous people and slavery. And I guess the second point is, and it goes to like the end of where you end, which is that we need to kind of build this citizens' welfare state. And this is what I think we've been talking about really for the past 2 hours. And so this gets to Emily's question, like, is there a place for prisons within that kind of a a welfare state. And even as you say in the paper, you know, if these controls are in place and if people have resources, will the kind of resources that you're talking about, will we still see crime and harm and violence in the ways that we do today?
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. So we touch up to the abolition argument again and again and again, and thanks for putting it in the mix. Eddie, I want to give you a chance, and then Marcia, saw you had your hand. So go ahead, Marcia. We'll come to you, and then ask David to respond. Thanks.
Thank you again. So just a quick comment. I think that there's a lot that we could learn, obviously, from other countries, or recognizing the differences as well. I think about what's happening here in the state of Illinois. Just a couple of weeks ago, Heidi Miller, the executive director of the juvenile prisons here, pretty much they're closing down all the juvenile facilities in the state of Illinois. And so just about 5, maybe 6 years ago, Candace Jones, who's now the CEO of a major foundation out on the West Coast, I mean the East Coast, the Public Welfare Foundation, you know, when she was in that same position and they were closing down one of the state prisons for juveniles down south, it was interesting in the story that she shares, which I'm going to paraphrase, which ultimately is you have all these, you know, rural Clutter County folks, you know, predominantly all white, who are depending on these jobs, right, for corrections, and they didn't see, right, how challenging it was, or they didn't see the value of the fact that they are incarcerating young kids, particularly Black and brown kids. And so it's not until we're able to change that culture, right, that we're going to be able to see the value in human beings. And I think part of it is, how does from a business perspective, do we see the value of this population? And I think that's something that we, in the last maybe 10 years, we started kind of realizing more and more that there's actually a potential untapped resource there. I don't want to go obviously spend more time on that, because I'm also going to be contradicting many of our comments here, including myself. But I think there's what I would ask from David is, like, in his comparison, or he's doing this research, were there any other examples in the U.S. that are worth noting, so that we could gravitate and say, hey, how do we look at this example and think about magnifying that and going deeper as part of our larger strategy?
Great. Chance for here a commercial announcement to a Square One paper by Vinnie Schiraldi, calling for the abolition of youth prisons and noting some progress in that direction. So Marcia, we'll turn to you, and then David, coming back to you for any reactions to what you've heard.
Okay, so I wanted to just follow up. Eddie kind of touched on the point that I wanted to make, which was what I found missing from this report, along with some of what the other colleagues have already mentioned, is this notion of this is a huge institution all over this country that is who works in it, you know, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, so on and so forth. They have livelihoods. They don't, you know, if we undo this system and do away with it, where do they go to work, right? And it's the same thing with when we talk about reforming or defunding or divesting of the police department. What happens to all, you know, people pay mortgages, people send their kids off to college. So there's a whole area of work that needs to be well thought out about, and what is it that we need to lead in thinking about these things as we also dismantle these systems.
So we're going to turn to David for his reactions to what he has heard. I want to acknowledge that after we got started, we were joined midway by two of our colleagues, Eric Bringswhite, who was with us at our first session, and want to thank Eric for being with us. And Imara Jones. Imara, I'm gonna when we get together next time, I'm going to ask you to do, as I have with everybody else, take a moment to introduce yourself, so that we get a sense of the work you're doing. And I've already said that I am jealous of your title about something about special advisor for the social contract or something like that. But we'll give you that floor next time we get together. But it's good to have you here. So David, some quick reactions, and then we'll turn to Bruce for our wrap up. You're on mute. You're on mute. David, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So I've written down mostly what people said, and I take them to be kind of friendly amendments requiring me to complicate notions that are in the paper of political economy, of crime, of the various mediations and responses that are going on. The one thing that I find really interesting and want to take issue with, and it might be helpful for the group as a whole, is Emily's point about punishment. And I think we need to differentiate between American conceptions of punishment, the contemporary practice of punishment, the way that people in the USA assume punishment, you know, means imprisonment and means lengthy terms of imprisonment and so on. None of that is essential. None of that is required. There's no universal commitment to that kind of behavior. But I do think, and I want to emphasize this, that punishment, by which I mean an authoritative condemnation of wrongful behavior backed up by some kind of sanction, that I think that that's essential to group life. I don't think you can have a normative morality without it being, you know, backed up by punishment and enforced by punishment. But punishment needn't mean anything other than, you know, like a raised eyebrow. It needn't be anything more than a fine if we're talking about criminal justice and real. But there's no escaping the importance of punishment as a backup to law and to norms. So I do think that some kind of punishment is always necessary. I think that, you know, it's like going from 100 to 1 in terms of where the US is currently and what the kind of necessary minimum would look like. So that's simply a kind of, I think, an analytical point, that there's no escaping some notion of punishment. And of course, in pragmatic real terms, if we got to the rate of imprisonment that we used to have in 1980, would be enormously improved, and we'd still be way higher than Western European countries are. So we're not talking about abolishing punishment any more than we can talk about, I think, abolishing policing. We can talk about abolishing warrior policing or American-style policing or American-style punishment. These are very different things. Thank you.
You're muted, Jeremy.
Could you sit with that for one more second? Emily made a suggestion about the use of the word accountability as different. I'm not sure she said as a substitute, but as a different concept. Could you just react to that part of what she said as well before we move on?
So, are you asking me, Jeremy?
Yep, please. Yep.
Yeah. So I missed the point about accountability. Accountability, holding people to account, making someone responsible for something. I think that condemnation of wrongful behavior is more than different from that. And I think that there is a requirement, if we regard something as being morally required, like a criminal law is morally required, not all criminal laws in this over-criminalized, crazy penal code society, but in most societies, there's a core of, you know, in, say, things that every society criminalizes. And we regard them not just as being against the criminal law, but we regard them as wrongful. And I think to say something is wrongful is not just to say, you know, you're responsible for this and therefore we'll hold you accountable. You know, maybe you didn't bring the budget in properly, you know, maybe you overspent, you're accountable and responsible for that, but it's not to be condemned necessarily. But if you're, you know, if the budget's off because you corruptly appropriated some money, that's to be condemned and punished. I think these are different things.
Okay, thank you.
They overlap, but different.
So we always look for these moments of disagreement in any group. So this helps us think about issues in their complexity, helps us respect the views of colleagues. We hopefully take out of this something that'll stick with us after today. And what an important question. So thank you, Emily, for raising it as clearly as you did, and David for responding as clearly as you did. So we turn next to Bruce, and for those who are with us for the first time, Bruce is the person we turn to just help us reflect on the journey we've traveled in this particular session. And this is always a good setup for the next step in our journey as we get together next time. Bruce.
Yeah. I can't resist just a footnote on the exchange between David and Emily. I think where David landed for me is very very close actually to a restorative justice idea, where, the starting point of which is causing harm to someone else incurs obligations, and that is the starting point for restorative justice process. I think it's the ideas are very close. I wouldn't say exactly identical, but very close.
We clearly need another square one paper here. Just saying.
I know. Okay, three ideas. I feel I was kind of Aisha's comment, what's cart, what's horse, in reflecting on the two papers. I think I was in the same boat there. So here are my three big ideas. So in a way that I see the two papers as really in dialogue with each other, and our discussion in the first hour and the second hour bookends. And in Elizabeth's paper, the way I hear it in the following discussion, we're really talking about a transfer of power, and the direct funding of communities was a way of empowering those communities. The second hour was about structural change. We looked to Western Europe in David's analysis as a fundamentally, structurally different political economy that has an entirely different set of justice institutions, an entirely different set of social outcomes. Transferring power. So what was power in our discussion? And I think this is kind of a key question that we're all wrestling with in this moment, actually, and definitely in the historical example that Elizabeth is talking about, and in the contemporary experience of people around the table too. Power partly means money and organisation, and part of what the community investment of the Great Society era was doing was providing money, not in an indiscriminate way, not through social transfers, but to organisations that were representing, in some sense, their communities. And I felt a lot of our conversation was trying to elaborate this idea of what power is. Yes, it is organisation. Yes, it does involve money. But I thought different ideas of power also arose in the discussion, and I really think they're relevant for the processes we're confronting today. Different kinds of players in the field have different kinds of symbolic power, and Aswad spoke to the power of victims and victim voice as having a special kind of power in the political conversation about justice. Courtney spoke about the power of history, and I think this means that making change right, if there's going to be a transfer of power, which is how we can think about change from the starting point that Elizabeth gave us, then all of the residue of historical inequalities and injustices that we're living with today, the transfer of power is going to have to deal with that historical residue in some way. So history does have to be dealt with because it's a repository of enormous power. The thrust of Elizabeth's analysis, right, is power is transferred to community. So my second point is community, and we talked a lot about that in different ways. Community is complex, right? And I think our starting point in our conversation was the empowerment of communities could lead to really significant change. That's the transfer of power that we're talking about and are interested in. But communities are complex. They're subject to their own inequalities, for one. And when I think David talks about local majoritarianism, he's pointing to that. I think Gabriel is also speaking to that. There are inequalities within localities that we don't want to unwittingly reproduce. Communities are also struggling with an enormous amount of harm, and the disadvantage that many communities have been subject to affects their capacity to seize the reins of power, to take full advantage of the power that they might have. That's how I hear Fatima saying, she's in doing work around trauma, and the people who work in that space are themselves having to contend with trauma in their own biographies. And so this idea of transferring power to communities is complicated. Communities are shot through with their own power relations. The capacity of communities in many cases has been constrained by all of the harm that's been piled onto them. This makes me think that we should be thinking of sort of a CAP 2.0 rather than doing CAP again, but better. In which there's a role for government, I tend to think, to support community power in a more robust way. It means more than just transferring funds to community organisation. It also means actively supporting the development of political capacity. I think that's what I take away from. And I think that is qualitatively different from the kind of historical example that Elizabeth was describing about the 1960s. So third point, transformational change. So we're transferring power to produce this big structural change, right? That's what does that look like? It's at least two things. It's an institutional change, right? And David spoke a lot about the change in our justice institutions, and also, fundamentally a change in our social policy institutions as well. The development, I think this was Elizabeth's words, the citizens' welfare state. So it's an institutional change, and a lot of people also spoke to a change of ideology. Right, a change of a shared sense of who is deserving, who has a seat at the table, and in different ways I heard Chaz talk about this, and Jorge and Eddie. So what is this? Change? It is this citizens' welfare state that David described, and Europe is the exemplar. I think that an implication here for us is that we often point to social policy as the ideal kind of justice reform we would like to see in the United States. But the problem is American social policy is very emaciated, it's very inequality reproducing. You know, if you look at Medicaid, you know, half the states still have not adopted Medicaid expansion under the ACA. So our social policy institutions are not going to be the answer to justice reform. It will be social policy of a different kind again. And Kima, I thought, really made that point explicit. And part of the consequence of this more robust citizens' welfare state that David was describing is that, you know, community safety itself becomes a different thing. The agents of safety are not our criminal justice institutions. They're families and businesses and faith organisations and all of the web of social life that does all of the work of informal control and socialisation that David was talking about. And I thought Aisha's point here was right on, that the whole project of justice reform in this very transformational way is just inescapably an economic justice project. And I think an implication is that we need to be facile with that language and those policy instruments as we are with the criminal justice system. The big unanswered question that I have is the how question, right? How do we produce this social process that transfers power in this meaningful way and creates this transformational change? We got glimpses of it in the discussion. I would sort of like to put a pin in that as a theme that we return to in subsequent meetings. I feel we've got sort of the template of a discussion here, but there are still critical pieces that we need to fill in.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Before I offer some closing remarks, I want to just acknowledge that this is that time of day where if you're feeling like you've got a headache, or there's just too much going on, or it's just like hard to sort through what you just heard, that's what we wanted. So that's the goal here, is to just keep filling your head with ideas, keep thinking about ways that we can relate to each other in the future, and get some more sort of conversations going. And remember, at the end, our last time together, we're talking about, so what might this all look like? So we do, without wanting to tie a ribbon on it, we do want to sort of try to pull these threads together before our time is up. Aisha, see you have your hand up. Yep. Would you like to say something before we wrap up? Of course.
Yes, really quickly. Next week, we're going to talk about 3 different papers, and I just wanted to maybe flag that I think that's going to be really hard given the topics. And I'm just wondering if it would be worth considering moving one of those papers to the session with Bruce. I'm not trying to tell you how to run your program at all. I'm not trying to be disrespectful to the program. No. I just think that the conversations based on the ones we've had so far with those 3 topics together, I just don't want it to be, I would wish for that to happen and elevate it in front of people and not behind.
We will, and don't apologize, please. We like suggestions and comments. We'll take it up with our group as to how we manage the rest of the time together. And yes, when you look at housing, education, and health, I mean these are 3 big topics, right? So we're gonna try to do them all in 2 hours. Yep. Okay. We're nothing if not ambitious. So
I will say, just to give a little comfort, or if that is thing, we will talk about it, because we knew that it, particularly in this new format that we're driven into, where we don't have as much time for each thing, that we always walk away feeling like we don't have enough time, and that's even the more the case here. our current plan is that we will hear from our authors briefly all together and then have a conversation for an hour and a half or more on the topics collectively, just so that we aren't going to try to have everybody only have 22 minutes to be able to talk about the paper. So, but I think you're right, and we will be thinking about how we can best work together over this remaining little bit of time that we have. So thank you. Aisha.
Particularly given your observation, Aisha, we can't do justice reform without this, right? So it's like a precondition. So I'll have some closeout observations, but let me just turn it over to Suki to give her parting thoughts.
Thank you, Jeremy. So just real quickly, a little housekeeping. As usual, you're going to get your survey tomorrow. It's just a quick Google form asking if you have any follow-up thoughts based on the conversation we had here today, and also following up on any tech issues you might have had. So we want y'all to be comfortable during these sessions. And yeah, that'll also include in your feedback some of the comments that were captured in the chat today. I'll be sure that those are pulled out of there. Eric, I caught yours as well. He sent me an awesome comment privately, so I can't have that stand. So I'm going to share that, Eric. I'll make sure I get your permission, but it's too good to not share publicly. So that's it. You'll get that tomorrow, and we'll ask that you complete it by end of business on Friday.
Okay. This is an appropriate opportunity for me to thank Suki for helping us do what we're doing here, not just in terms of the technology, but more importantly, substantively. This is a very rich conversation, and we had great participation today, for which I'm grateful. And what a group we've assembled, with thanks to the Square One